Hello everyone and welcome to yet another day in this, the clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. But on the bright side of this video, I will say, this is actually making me feel a bit better with the interview I'm about to go through, because it shows me that the children at Novara Media didn't get what they wanted and now they want to throw all of their toys out the pram when they don't get their way. And so I'm very happy that their preferred Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn, was effectively completely kicked out of the Labour Party, and most of his most vehement supporters were kicked out from senior positions too. Because it shows that although Starmer's Blairism is still alive and well, at least we won't have overt socialism in the UK for some time, which, yes, is worse than the situation we are in now. Though I will say not much better. But just to introduce this, Ash Sarkar interviewed Bernie Sanders recently, and as you can see from the thumbnail, the main point that apparently Novara Media's editors and probably Ash Sarkar wants to get across is that, Bernie Sanders fails the purity test. Bernie Sanders won't answer on Gaza, which I hope they think that that is better than him openly coming out for Israel. I mean, he is Jewish. I don't know why he wouldn't. But this interview was 20 minutes long, and the conversation about Israel and Gaza was probably about 5 minutes of it. But I just want to go through the main points of this interview, because I just want to show you how childish people like Ash Sarkar and Novara Media are, because I've covered them quite a lot, but I don't think anything has been as childish as getting literally the most friendly and high-profile face of your politics in the mainstream and effectively bullying him over some war going on the other side of Europe, literally on the other side of the earth from America. But hey, I guess as the neocons say, Israel's security is our security. I suppose communists saying Gaza's retribution is our retribution go hand in hand. So let's take a look at this interview anyway.
Senator Sanders, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So your book is called It's Okay to be Angry About Capitalism. And for me, the question is, well, how angry?
A big theme of this is going to be childish politics, and already Bernie Sanders' book, It's Okay to be Angry About Capitalism, it's already quite childish, quite a childish premise. Even the summary seems very childish. It's okay to be angry about capitalism, it's okay to want something better. Bernie Sanders takes on the 1% and speaks blunt truths about the system that is fueled by uncontrolled greed and rigged against ordinary people, where a handful of oligarchs have never had it so good, with more money than they could spend in 1,000 lifetimes, and the vast majority struggle to survive, where a decent standard of living for all seems like an impossible dream. And it goes into stats about 3 billionaires having more wealth than half the country. Is this acceptable? It's all as you'd expect. They're not angry at capitalism, they are angry that people are richer than them. And I'm really not surprised that the same publication that published Fully Automated Luxury Communism would be happy with another book that is effectively saying, why do people have more money than me? Because that's effectively all these people end up complaining about, as we will get into. And just to be clear, I am not a fan of the system at the moment. However, I'm, as arrogant as this sounds, a lot more intelligent than these people. I look a little bit beyond what my own initial emotional reactions are to these things and realise, oh, we don't actually live under capitalism at all. Because I'm not the type of person with an emotional attachment to all these sorts of labels. The best you could probably get out of me is that I have a emotional aversion to some labels. I don't like being called a communist or a fascist, for example. But my point being is that if 3 people in the US are richer than the bottom half, I don't see that as inherently a bad thing. And to be honest with you, those billionaires are generally earning the money via, owning businesses that are providing for the vast majority of people in the world. Everyone uses Windows, pretty much. And I could go on, but let's just get to the interview.
Is it blowing up an oil pipeline angry, or voting for a slightly better candidate angry?
It's very, very angry because the future of democracy is at stake, the future of the planet is at stake, the future of the ability of working people to have a decent life is at stake.
It's something that I constantly need to be reminded about, but realistically, life is getting better for everyone. Really, the issue, especially in the UK, is that productivity has stagnated. It's not that it's going down, it's that it's stagnated. And then you have the other issue of 1 million immigrants coming in a year, and then what that does is lower GDP per capita, which obviously causes knock-on issues, but then everyone complains that, things are getting more expensive, like, say, housing. But the thing is that the reason housing is more expensive is partially because of the large amount of immigrants, partially because we're not building enough, partially because of interest rates and all this stuff, but also you got to bear in mind, when your parents bought a house, it won't have had central heating, it won't have had insulation and double glazed windows, it won't have had all these things that we actually take for granted now. So these standards of living are getting better. You're not getting as cold at night as your parents would be. The only reason I have since I've bought the house is because the boiler broke down, but hey, guess what? It took a day for the boiler man to come out and he fixed it straight away. Your parents would have been lucky to have a boiler, so look at it on the bright side of that way. Things are getting better, people are just taking it more for granted. I do want to point out as well that I enjoy Bernie Sanders' very, very diplomatic answer of very, very angry, where he doesn't commit to saying we should blow up oil pipelines, but does at the same time say the planet is at stake. Read into that what you will.
But we got to be smart. And we got to figure out how can we be effective in taking on people with enormous power.
I'd like to remind people at this point that Bernie Sanders is a millionaire, and I would not be shocked that if Ash Sarkar can afford not only a place to live in London, but to go out regularly in London and also go on holidays from London, I wouldn't be particularly shocked if her net wealth wasn't somewhere near £1 million. Which again, I'm just going to make the point that this is people who are complaining that people are richer than them, but these are two people that are very, very comfortable with where they are. And if they were serious about helping the working man up or helping people have a better life, they'd be investing their money into ways that would actually improve them. Private charities would be a good example. Investing in hostels that run programs to help these people find jobs and places to live. But they don't do that. Instead, all they want to do is vote for ways that will force the rich people to pay more taxes, and then what are the rich people going to do? They're just going to jump ship, they're going to move elsewhere. And all that's going to do is hit into your tax budget that you want improved to give poor people free things anyway. So, shooting yourself in the foot with your own policy suggestions.
So the book focuses a lot on oligarchs. All right, what does that mean? It means that in the world today, the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 99%.
Yes, and that's probably always going to be the case and was probably always the case. And if every attempt to equalise that has ended up with more inequality than that, I don't think it's the correct course of action to go. But again, I want to remind everyone watching that these two people do not actually care about equality. They only care about bringing the people more successful than them and richer than them down. That's all any of this is about.
In my country, richest country on earth, the United States, 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. But their power is not just money, it's how they use money. They own much of the media.
The top 3 billionaires in the US are Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates. And only 2 of them own some sort of media. Elon Musk obviously owns X, or Twitter as everyone still calls it. Jeff Bezos still owns Amazon, which is making its own shows, and then you've got Bill Gates, who, if we're going to be worried about Bill Gates, I think we should be worried about all the farmland he's trying to buy up. I also find the other funny thing is that, I know it's an American problem, but the entire media class was and is still completely against Donald Trump, who he himself is a billionaire, and also quite the simp for capitalism, and yet Bernie Sanders can't seem to realise that, yes, the oligarchs are trying to keep their power, as all oligarchs will, but if he thinks that it is purely to keep capitalism in place, he's completely wrong. It's actually to kick it out, because capitalism gives the little people the chance to innovate and become millionaires and billionaires themselves through their own hard work and good decisions. But Bernie Sanders isn't for that. Bernie Sanders is for punishing people richer than him.
All right. In terms of American politics, if you are a billionaire, you can now spend as much money as you want, hundreds of millions of dollars, to defeat Bernie Sanders, to support some right-wing candidate.
Support some right-wing candidate like President Biden, Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton? Are we serious here? Don't get me wrong, I know the Republican Party has money behind it. It obviously does. Absolutely every party in the world has money behind it. And I wouldn't be shocked if the DNC did oust Bernie Sanders via non-democratic means. But again, to blame this all on capitalism is just so childish. I don't even think he could give a decent definition of capitalism, as most Zoomers and millennials can't.
So what you're seeing now is democracy, in quotes, being owned by big money. You're seeing more concentration of ownership. Many of the large companies you have here, we have in the United States. They're all over the world, controlled by a very few people.
Again, a really ironic thing to say when all this money is being pumped in, and yet Nikki Haley loses out to literally none of the above. None of these candidates won in Nevada. And I wouldn't be shocked if Donald Trump does really well again. Because while yes, Donald Trump does have money behind him, it's quite clear that most of the money is going behind the more mainstream candidates like Nikki Haley, like Joe Biden. And I'm sorry, Bernie, you're just not as popular as Donald Trump, and I don't think you're ever going to be. And if you're putting all the blame on money, well, I'm very sorry to tell you, but Donald Trump did not win the presidency and probably isn't going to win this presidential candidacy due to the money behind him. In fact, I think it is despite the lack of money behind him. Because you're right, Bernie, people are fed up of the rich people putting their money behind these useless candidates who aren't going to do much for them. However, these people don't care that billionaires exist. In fact, they see themselves, as John Steinbeck famously put it, temporarily embarrassed billionaires. All they want is the opportunity to become one of them. And the best way to do that, oddly enough, is through capitalism.
And then with artificial intelligence coming and robotics coming, what do we do about that? Who's going to benefit from all that?
The people already asking for it to be regulated so that when it is regulated, only those companies have the resources and money to actually carry on investigating AI rather than allowing it to be investigated by smaller companies and literally single people.
So the challenge that we face, in my view, how do we bring people together, country by country and internationally, to tell the oligarchs that this world belongs to all of us, not just a few people? That's the challenge that we have. Ain't easy, believe me.
Well, it's not going to happen because one of the largest fights, especially in Britain, is a good way of thinking about it is between people in the countryside and people in the cities. And this is the thing. This is happening on the planet-wide scale as well. Well, Western world scale, I guess. And it's why you're seeing so many farmers protesting in Europe at the moment. It's because people in the cities do, and these politicians are city people, by the way, they don't understand how the rural side of things work. They don't understand farming. They don't understand how difficult it is for farmers to actually make money. So they come in with all this legislation to limit pollution and things like that, and farmers just say, no, you don't understand, we need that so that you can eat our food. And because farmers actually want to be able to make money to actually live a life, they've started just going into, Paris is the best example, and just putting cow manure everywhere, setting things on fire. In Britain, it's happening to a much lesser scale because we're not as rioty as the French. But again, Bernie Sanders isn't talking about country people when he's talking about the little people. He's talking about the people in inner cities, the people, say, renting in London or renting in New York, who feel like their life is a bit of a standstill. And it's just very easy to say to these people, the reason your life doesn't feel like it's going anywhere is because of those rich people. When in reality, it's probably because they've either made bad choices, they're bad at budgeting, and they struggle to form relationships, which, by the way, is the best way to buy a house. Pretty much everyone I know who owns property brought it with someone else, who's my age, by the way, that's under 30. So in short, I think Jordan Peterson is better to take advice from than Bernie Sanders, who would have thunk.
In the book, you give the example of a criminal who walks into a shop and he shoots the clerk behind the counter, and the very clear societal repercussions for that.
Right.
He'll probably lose his job, he'll probably go to jail.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'd love to see how this relates to billionaires.
Whereas for oligarchs who profit off the misery of working class people, for fossil fuel CEOs, for arms manufacturers, there's no such repercussions.
If this doesn't show you how childish this whole worldview is, I don't know what will. They are equating people having an awful lot of money, which again, generally most of that money is coming via perfectly legitimate means, with a robber who shoots dead a grocery store clerk. They think it's petty crime. And I get the point of his analogy is that I think billionaires are destroying the planet and therefore they need to suffer repercussions, but it's an analogy that simply isn't helpful. It's not even comparable. In the Western world, when people die at work, it's due to fairly understandable risk that is happening at the job. People installing solar panels fall off rooftops. People working on oil rigs can end up falling off the side and being lost to the ocean. People working with dangerous chemicals can breathe them in and end up with health complications. And the thing is that for most of these things, there are health and safety guidelines that are in the way to minimise the risk. But obviously they can't make it 0% and these things need to be done. However, when you look over at, I don't know, China or something like that, they've literally had to install suicide nets to stop the monotony of their work from literally causing them to want to kill themselves. And generally when people kill themselves in, the UK or the US, it's not generally because they hate their work life. An awful lot of the time, suicide is actually down to a very deep feeling of loneliness, and that people don't care or want to help them. And that's a little different to your average worker feeling very overworked in China. So, yeah, again, not a particularly helpful analogy there, Mr. Sanders.
Do you think, deep down, do you feel like these are people who should really be in prison?
I can only understand why Ash Sarkar is popular when she's on a panel saying, I'm literally a communist, and effectively calling Tories scum in smart ways. When you actually listen to her planned interviews, though, she isn't very good. Because the whole setup to this question was, oh, so you think billionaires are like robbers who shoot store clerks? Do you think they're bad people? Oh, what a pointless question. Of course he does. And the question shouldn't be, do you think that they should be punished? I think the question should more be, what made you come up with that analogy? Why do you think that billionaires are like robbers who shoot store clerks? How does the analogy work here? But Ash Sarkar's never going to ask that question because she completely agrees with Bernie Sanders, and it just makes for a very boring interview because all she's really goading out of him is, oh, you want a complete revolution, don't you? And that's never going to happen, and is a very, very childish outlook on the modern world because, let's be honest here, there isn't going to be a revolution simply for the fact that most leftists are weedy midwits who probably don't really know how to fight. I mean, obviously you've got Antifa, but even reading Andy Ngo's book on Antifa, that makes up at most maybe 1,000 people. It's not very many people. Now, they are causing problems, don't get me wrong, but the most they managed to do was take over central Seattle for, what, 2 weeks? And they couldn't even grow food. So I've got no worries about a violent revolution coming, but Ash Sarkar and Bernie Sanders, they're trying to imply that they want a violent revolution without saying it, because that would probably get them kicked off all these platforms.
The answer is yes and no. The answer is they're not breaking the law. And you know why? Because they write the law.
This is true to an extent. They certainly are involved in lobbying, but even then, there's an awful lot of counter-lobbying to, obviously, fight back against this sort of thing. And you're actually seeing this in real time, especially with vaping. It's been proven that vaping is 96% more safe than smoking was, and smoking's a great one. Obviously, you had smoking lobbies trying to prove that things like secondhand smoking weren't a health risk, and then you had anti-smoking lobbies that went the complete other way, and the anti-smoking lobby obviously won out of that. And now we're seeing the same thing with vaping, where vaping is a lot safer. Okay, it can cause some health complications in some people, and now they're trying to basically ban it for everyone. And you're seeing this all over the world. Do you think it's capitalism and capitalists saying, I don't want to sell these things? Or do you think it's crazy people that Bernie Sanders supports that is putting the money in to fight that? And it's the same with the climate change lobby. It's not capitalists who are pushing for the climate change. I mean, obviously you are getting people like that saying, oh, don't you fly planes while Taylor Swift flies in a private jet over the Super Bowl or whatever. But realistically, it's not, say, the budget airlines that are pushing for this. It's not even British Airways that are pushing for this. It's people that don't make their money off, say, fossil fuels, just to put it lightly. And even then, the fossil fuel energy companies, they're being forced into looking into making renewable energy. And part of the reason for that is because they get massive subsidies from the government. Again, the push for this whole change in culture and the change in the way our entire transport and energy systems work, it's coming from the billionaires that people like Ash Sarkar and Bernie Sanders are saying, oh, they're causing all these issues. Like, yeah, I get it. Their carbon footprint is probably bigger than the average person's, but it's the average person who is going to suffer the most under that to reduce the carbon footprint. Realistically, the best answer to it is just to put a carbon tax on, make people pay a bit more if they do use their private planes or, do need petrol in their car. I mean, to be honest with you, the money that from British sales of petrol and diesel just needs to be put to the right places. The expense of petrol and diesel is bad enough. But use that money to go to carbon capture storage. Use that money to subsidise, say, nuclear fusion and fission, which are much more efficient than the wind farms and the solar panels we're trying to put the money toward now. That's probably the best answer to this, but they're never going to say that. They're just going to say, I want billionaires dead.
Right? But from a moral perspective, what do? Not a lot of people know this, but the fossil fuel industry knew 70 years ago that carbon emissions were going to warm the planet and cause massive destruction.
So 70 years ago was the 1950s. And here is a snippet of Newsweek saying the cooling world. And yes, effectively, this was scientific consensus at the time, that we are actually going to see average temperatures dropping, and we're probably going to get some sort of snowball Earth, and people are going to die of cold and all that. There has been scares about the climate forever, because ever since we've killed God, apparently we need something to be scared of, some existential threat that we need to put absolutely all our efforts towards. And when it's not, say, trying to get closer to God and get away from temptations from the devil, you end up instead in positions like Ash Sarkar and Bernie Sanders of, oh, we hate billionaires. Did you know 70 years ago they knew that they were going to cause global warming? Well, apparently they didn't. Apparently the science says otherwise. And this is what happens when, effectively, the world does become atheist. You start putting your faith in other things, and apparently one of those things is the science. And once you do it with the science, you start just believing everything that comes out of it without actually going back and actually seeing, is the science telling us the truth? And the answer is no, apparently not here. We have known since the 1800s that carbon dioxide emissions do cause global warming. That was proven. But obviously the science at this time found that it wasn't doing enough to counteract this cooling world that we see here. And unfortunately now it's gone the other way, and now it's, we have an existential threat of global warming due to CO2 emissions. But if you ever listen to Matt Ridley or Bjorn Lomborg, it's not going to destroy the planet. And in fact, the problems that we will face are going to be perfectly reasonably dealt with via the increase in economic activity that we will have from using fossil fuels until we have the alternatives in place. And a similar thing probably happened with this global cooling thing. So no, these people are just trying to find an existential threat and then use that to say, we need to kill billionaires. That's all this entire interview is really about here.
You know what they did about that? They lied. They formed organizations, spent millions of dollars trying to hide that reality.
I mean, I knew that was coming as well. If I showed this to Bernie Sanders or Ash Sarkar, they would probably say, oh, well, they paid scientists to say that, without a single hint of irony that the same thing could be happening today. Whereas given that I have studied science, I understand how these things end up happening. You do end up with a prevailing view, and then a lot of scientists try and go out of their way to try and prove that prevailing theory true. They will be quite selective with the data they use, and then it ends up with a little bit of a paradigm shift when people who are actually looking at the data properly will say, oh, yeah, no, this isn't what it's saying. And surprisingly, a lot of the time, it's actually people outside of the actual subject that manages to do this. I mean, a great example is in geology. The whole idea of plate tectonics, which is effectively a proven theorem at this point, was discovered and put forward by a meteorologist. And that's another reason that these things are quite hard to overturn, because people aren't going to listen to outside of their discipline, and yet outside of their discipline actually tend to be the ones to cause the paradigm shifts.
Right now, you have pharmaceutical companies that have products that cost a few cents to produce, a drug that costs a few cents to produce. There are poor children all over the world who are dying because they don't have that. And they got it. They say, you can't afford the price we're charging you, you're going to die.
Bernie Sanders is a millionaire and does have the means to actually buy an awful lot of these drugs at the price. Bernie Sanders has the means to actually make his own factory to make these drugs and then basically give them away. Is he going to do that, though? Of course he isn't, because as is classic for socialists and communists, it's got to be someone else doing this. I just want to go away and write my, poetry or whatever. Which is why it ends up taking people in uniforms coming along with a gun saying, get in the goddamn mines. And I wouldn't be shocked if Ash Sarkar is someone volunteering to get in that uniform with a gun to tell people like, oh, I don't know, Jeff Bezos to get in the mines.
It's all legal, all right? So what we have to do is change a system which allows murder to be legal and create a world and we can do that with a very different value system.
Yeah, you can absolutely make things like slavery illegal and then go all over the world to enforce that ideal. The British Empire literally did that. The American Empire could absolutely do that. Luckily, the American people don't want to bother with that. Like the American healthcare system, it's not great. Places like the Netherlands and Germany have much better healthcare systems while still having private hospitals, so really, Americans should quite like that system. But as I say, not everything they're saying is wrong. They are just looking at very, very specific examples that don't go against their idea of all billionaires are evil. Because the fact of the matter is that there are actually quite a lot of billionaires who are at least paying lip service to their politics and what they want, especially when it comes to climate change.
In the United States, there is a definition of freedom, which defines freedom as the freedom to profit, the freedom to be an entrepreneur, the freedom from state interference.
Yes, I think a lot of people's ideals of that do come from what I term first layer liberalism, which is effectively the John Lockean sense of we don't want a tyranny taking over our lives. And that was kind of the whole point of the founding myths. It was the British are being tyrants. We are, they use the excuse of taxation without representation. Really what they wanted to do was have the freedom to actually expand to the west, but Britain wouldn't allow that. And I think that's fair enough to have a revolution over, to be quite honest with you. If the British are literally stopping you from doing what you want in virgin lands, then yeah, do what you can to gain that independence, and then, oh, look what happened. You made the biggest country in the world at the moment. You made a world hegemon from that. That's fair enough. So obviously, if you've made a world hegemon from effectively saying we don't want to live under the tyrannical George III and their parliament that we have no say in, then yeah, as I say, fair enough. You probably have justification there. This is about as anti-British as I'm ever going to get on this channel, by the way. So it's no wonder that the ideal American definition of freedom is literally, I don't want the government telling me what I can and can't do. Because that's literally what all the founding fathers said. And the ideal of that you can see through the American system and history until really you get to the start of the 20th century, where, let's be absolutely reasonable here, French influence clearly took over, and it was decided that actually freedom doesn't mean freedom from the government anymore. It means the government will make you free, comrade. You get the New Deal, you get a bunch of social security stuff. And the thing is that I understand the intention was to help with the Great Depression and a lot of people's issues with their economic situation. But all it seems to have ended up doing is making a federal government that refuses to enforce its southern border and forcing states like Texas to try and enforce their own border. But I have no doubt in my mind that Bernie Sanders and Sarkar think the idea that you should be free from government tyranny is bad. So let's hear what they have to say.
Does that mean that lack of healthcare, lack of corporate regulation, that's the price you have to pay for freedom?
It's corporate regulation that is causing the American healthcare system to be the way it is, unfortunately. The whole reason that you have big pharma is because you have these big pharmaceutical companies constantly lobbying the government to say, can we be the only ones to actually make this drug? Because if we're the only ones making this drug, we have a monopoly on it and we can charge whatever price we want. Where in reality, if you didn't have these big pharma companies actually lobbying for that sort of thing, you'd see a lot more diversity in the people creating these drugs. I mean, hell, why do you think there's only ever been 2 motor car companies in the US, which obviously is Ford and General Motors? The answer is because they lobbied to the point where you could only make Fords and General Motor cars, and if you try and make anything else, it's illegal. I will forever die on this hill that the biggest issue we have in the 21st century to economic prosperity is regulations that are keeping these large companies in place. So one of the first things Rockefeller did when he made his billions from transporting kerosene across the country on railway tracks, he lobbied the government to effectively put in regulations so he could be the only person to do that. Again, start of the 20th century, it's when the government got big enough to actually be able to do that.
No, of course it's not. What does freedom mean? That's a great question, all right? If I'm sleeping out on the street, am I free?
Yes, you are. We could go all the way back to, say, caveman times. These people living in caves and having such squalid, short and brutish lives, they were absolutely and completely free, assuming that it wasn't another tribe that came in and were dictating them to them what they can and can't do. Yes, that is freedom. Freedom doesn't mean you have a successful and prosperous life. Freedom means that there is no one getting in the way of you getting to that life. If you make poor choices and you do end up in the street, yes, that is your fault. That does not mean you are not free. And you know what, fair enough, sometimes it is just pure bad luck that leads to things like that. But hey, I'm not saying just leave people out on the streets, they're free. Obviously, you are completely free to use your money, time and resources to help these people. That is the point of charity. And you give these people that little bit of help and hey, they can end up becoming millionaires out of it. They don't stop being free just because they don't own a house.
If I'm a worker forced to go to work at a job that I hate and I'm earning starvation wages, am I free?
Yes, I hate this argument. I had to work 60 hours a week for 2 years so that I could, one, have a bit of an income from working at a shop, and two, get the skills I needed to get a better job via an internship in software development. Now, I was very lucky in that I had parents who were more than willing to allow me to stay in their home for a bit of rent money. And part of the reason for that is that they could see that I was working really hard for these 2 years to try and improve my life. And they said, you know what, fair enough. This isn't fair. We'll help you out. And this is a thing as well. What these people like Ash Sarkar and Bernie Sanders want, they want to replace that, the love of my mother and father and their willingness to care for me, with a state that does that instead. And I think that is the most ridiculous thing I can think of. Left-wingers seem to absolutely hate the idea that parents do have responsibility over their kids, even past the age of 18. They seem, which is quite ironic because they're usually the ones saying, oh, don't kick out kids at 18. Barely anyone is being kicked out at the age of 18. Barely anyone. But the problem is that we have an awful lot of, younger generation families that are effectively in the mindset that it should be the government's job to look after their kids, should be the government's job to teach their kids everything, be the government's job to make sure their kids have a happy life. And the reality of the situation is that that's never been the case and can never be a sustainable case. We need strong family units. We need policy that incentivizes strong family units. And what can these people do? Well, they don't care about that. They just want billionaires punished for being rich, despite being millionaires themselves.
If I'm living in America and my kid gets sick and can't afford health care, and we have about 60,000 people a year die in the United States because they don't get health care when they should, am I free?
No, I do not think the healthcare system is free in either of my definitions, which is costing no money, or being able to set up a pharmaceutical business to actually make pharmaceutical drugs. It's very, very locked down, the pharmacy industry in America. And again, this is part of the reason that it becomes so unaffordable for some people. Despite the fact that the stats bear out that the idea that it makes people go bankrupt is, that's just way over-exaggerated. I mean, that's not to say that it is a good system. I don't think it is. But it's not as bad as shows like Breaking Bad make it out to be.
What does freedom mean? If I go to my job and I have nothing to say about my job, I'm your boss and I'm telling you what to do 8 hours, 10 hours a day. You free?
I don't know why Bernie Sanders is acting like you can't just leave that job and get another. I've had conversations with communists about this, and I've effectively said, if I don't like a job and I can't do anything about it, I just leave. I find another one. And they effectively say, don't you want to end that cycle? And this is the whole thing. They are literally just lazy. They think, oh, I have a job, I should just be able to live my entire life through this job and do whatever I can in this job to make it as easy as possible. And that's just not the reality of the situation at all. And it's never going to be. Even if they get their communist state, someone's still going to have to clean the toilet. And I can tell you now, it's only really, really weird people that enjoy cleaning toilets enough to actually get any source of meaning out of being a toilet cleaner. So few, in fact, that you are effectively going to have to force people to clean toilets. So the idea that, do I want the cycle to end? Well, I don't know. The alternatives don't look that much better. So no, I don't think so.
So we really have to be thinking about what the word freedom means and what the word democracy means.
Can you get to the point? You just went through a load of examples of here are aspects of freedom I don't like.
And in my view, and we touch on that quite a bit in the book, when we talk about democracy and when we talk about human rights, we're also talking about economic rights. You have the right to earn a decent standard of living. You have a right for decent housing, decent healthcare, decent educational opportunity. Now,
yeah, correct. Everyone absolutely does have the right to access these things. The problem is that when Bernie Sanders says this, what he means is no matter what is going on in their lives, no matter what choices they have made, no matter what they are doing with themselves, where their skill level is at, what job they have, they deserve access to all of these things. And that is obviously just nonsense. I did not deserve a house and to live my life in the ideal way I see fit just because I was stacking shelves at a supermarket for 20 hours a week. Even if I was working 40, I don't deserve that. And if I did, what would be the incentive to actually get a useful job? Why can't I just, dig holes and fill them up forevermore? Does it have to be productive work when I do this? Does it have to help other people? Does it have to be something of value when I have this job and then access to all these things, Bernie Sanders? The thing is that I think deep down, he doesn't think it does. He just thinks that if you live in this world, you should be able to access all of the luxuries of modern life. Whereas someone from my perspective says, You are very, very lucky to live in a world where you are not dying of dysentery at 15 after living in a cave for all those years with your parents, where your father goes out once every few days and risks his life just to get some meat.
People say, well, that's utopian. We can't afford to do that. You know what? We can afford to do that. But we can't afford to do that when 3 people in America own more wealth than the bottom half of American society.
Yeah. Tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich. I get it. You know, you start trying to do that, they all move to Switzerland, which, by the way, has pretty much solved all these issues anyway, and they don't even have a minimum wage law. So, you know, take from that what you will.
Now, we don't talk about those issues in America. I doubt you talk about it very much in the UK, do you? Is that an issue?
Oh, in Novara media we do,
You will
but
talk
the
about it, all
BBC,
right.
no.
All right.
No, because no one really cares if someone's richer than them. It's only people that never grew up that care that, oh, those people have more than me. I don't care. I've not even reached 30 and I don't care. You're older than me and it's all you seem to care about. Again, by the standards of the UK, Ash Sarkar is rich. Regular holidays abroad. I have not been able to afford that for coming up to 5 years. Affords to rent in London. Yeah, I can only dream of that, I'm afraid. Then again, I suppose I own a house, so swings and roundabouts. I could go on, but you get the idea. Ash Sarkar is living it pretty high when it comes to the standards of your average 30-odd-year-old. And if she had any sense, she'd do some philanthropy with that work, but we have completely lost that value when it comes to British society, because for some reason post-World War II everyone thought, oh, we should just get the big state to do all this. I suppose we've already got the infrastructure. And all it seems to have done is keep causing economic disasters throughout the 20th and 21st century. No, we did a complete paradigm shift on this, but the problem is that no one can accept it because people want to live in a utopia. Well, no one was under any illusion when we were a generally Christian country that we would ever get to a utopia, because it is impossible to make heaven on earth, and it's absolutely pointless trying to. So the best we can do is make life as easy as possible for everyone, and the best way to do that is through prosperity, and you don't get that via Bernie Sanders and Ash Sarkar.
But those are the issues that we have to talk about. Is it utopian to think that in the world right now, we can do a lot better than having 1% owning more wealth than the bottom 90%? I think we can.
Do you see what I mean? It's like, oh, can the world do better than economic inequality that we have that has been normal throughout history anyway? That's his priority. That is his number one priority, what he's talking about this whole time. Whereas my main priority is, how do we make the country more prosperous so that life is easier for everyone, so that when they do get a job, they can actually afford things and find it easier to work their way up, you know, get higher wages and all that. The best way to do that is to allow for innovation. But we don't allow for that, whereas you could in the Victorian era. But now, because the world is just full of monopolies that keep pushing for regulations that all it does is enforce their place in the world of business, you can't do it. You can't do it at all. The most innovative thing that I can think of in the past few years is a scrub daddy. And then obviously we have the MOD creating lasers that cost $10 a shot. Like, yeah, great stuff, but you think back to the Victorian period? My God. It just exploded with railway lines. It just exploded with new ways of transportation. It just exploded with new ways to produce textiles and things like that. Making clothing so cheap that it actually made it so that people generally weren't repairing their own clothes anymore. They just go out and buy a new one. Obviously, that's something we take for granted these days, obviously, but still. The point is that there doesn't seem to be much innovation going on, and the reason for that is because only a few companies are actually allowed to put it through. But these communists don't see that. They just see there are rich people and don't really look into how they're rich. They just say, oh, it must be capitalism because Marx said it was. Anyway, they start talking about trade unions and AI, and I just don't really care for that bit. I want to get to the main part that I wanted to get in this video, which is the whole Israel-Gaza situation. Because that was apparently the main takeaway that Ash Sarkar had from this entire conversation. And that's probably because when she asked him about his book and freedom, it was frightfully boring stuff about, oh yeah, he's talking about the 1% again. Yeah, we know all that, right? Not interesting, right? Let's move on. So here we are talking about Israel again. Go ahead, Ash Sarkar.
In your view, is what Israel is doing in Gaza a genocide?
Oh, God, it's because it's the most interesting thing we can talk about at the moment, isn't it? Can't talk about implications of geopolitics or anything like that. Just, is Israel's reaction to a terrorist attack on their own soil and having their own people taken hostage unreasonable and a genocide? And, I mean, the obvious answer is no. So let's hear what Bernie Sanders says.
In my view, it is absolutely disgraceful, horrible, and I'm doing, as a United States Senator, everything I can to end it.
Yeah, but which way are you going to end it? Are you saying ceasefire now, ceasefire now, with absolutely no other recourse? Or are you saying, Hamas, come on, free the hostages, right, Israel, stop bombing them, you've got what you wanted out of them? Because I'd love to know, because just saying I'm doing everything I can doesn't really tell you a lot, because there are about 10 different options that Israel and Gaza have. So I need to know which you support. As I'm sure Navarro Media wants to know which you support, but the fact you don't just say yes is quite funny to me, because it's going to make Ash keep pushing.
And where I'm sitting is, and I don't know how many people know this, every year the United States provides about $3.5 billion in military aid to Israel.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that an ally to the US is getting military aid from the US for defensive capabilities, because Hamas keep firing rockets at Israel. Again, I imagine that is a two-way street, because an awful lot of that military budget goes into Israeli military research and development. And guess what? They share it all with the US. So this is a thing I always hear. It's like, oh, they're just sending it there because, we have a lot of Jews in the US Senate or whatever. And no, the reality of the situation is that Israel is actually a country full of incredibly smart people who do incredibly good research and development. And the fact of the matter is that the US are effectively just paying for access to that. And I think that is a completely reasonable thing to do if you want to keep the biggest military in the world as state of the art.
On top of that, there is a bill, because a bill came up for not just all for Israel, $95 billion, including $14 billion for Israel. And I have led the opposition to that. I do not want to see the United States complicit in what Netanyahu and his right-wing lunatic friends are doing right now to the Palestinian people.
I mean, I've talked about Israel and Gaza about as much as I want to for the rest of my life here. But we can see that is his position. He clearly doesn't support Israel going into the Gaza and doing what they're doing. And you know what, if that's his position, fine. I don't really care. And obviously he's saying that he led the opposition toward that. But the thing with Ash Sarkar is that she asked, is what is going on a genocide? And she didn't get the answer to that. So obviously she's going to keep pushing.
So my job right now is to support what the United Nations is trying to do, have a humanitarian ceasefire.
Well, that was obviously going to happen. Ceasefire now, ceasefire now. Okay. Again, the reason there isn't a proper long-term ceasefire here is because there are still Israeli hostages in Gaza. And again, we never hear anything about criticism of Hamas, criticism of, hey, maybe they shouldn't have killed and raped a load of women and children. Maybe they shouldn't have taken hostages from Israel. Maybe at this point, if they release them, we can come to some different arrangement for Israel and Gaza. But you never hear that. No. What do you hear? Oh, I want a ceasefire. I support the UN in just calling for a generic ceasefire. It's government by slogans, and it sucks.
But do you buy the South African case at the International Court of Justice that what Israel is doing in Gaza constitutes genocide or genocidal acts?
I mean, for a start, it was really funny when South Africa did that, and then people like Owen Jones and Ash Sarkar were saying, oh, South Africa is now the leader of the free world, while it is, trying its best to get rid of white farmers. But I suppose both of them are on side with that. But I do just find this interview really funny, because Bernie Sanders gave a better answer than I hear from most leftists on the Israel-Gaza case. But for Ash Sarkar, it's not enough. No, she needs to hear Bernie Sanders, a Jew, by the way, saying, yes, I think Israel is currently committing a genocide. That's what she wants to hear, and if she doesn't hear that, then he's not good enough. This is the purity test, and I'm not being funny, it is cringe.
I think, look, we can argue about definitions. It is horrible. Right now, 29,000 people have been killed, and some 70,000 have been injured. Some 65% of the housing units have been destroyed or damaged. And I am worried right now.
I mean, even going back to his argument about freedom, he never actually gave a definition of freedom there. All we could actually extrapolate from what he was saying was that freedom is when you have absolutely everything you want in life, which is obviously just stupid, but still. When it comes then to the definition of genocide, he's doing the same thing. It's, is it a genocide? Well, 20-odd thousand people have been killed, 70-odd thousand have been injured. Then again, it is a country of 2 million people. And those numbers are about what you'd expect from a one-sided war. And then obviously he has to bring up the housing situation where, 65% of houses and dwellings within Gaza have been destroyed because, well, Hamas are hiding in them. And I've seen a new term coined, what was it, domicide, where it's the destruction of housing, and clearly it is people just trying to say, oh, it's a genocide, without it actually properly fitting the definition. Because as pro-Israel sides say constantly, and I buy this, they are the worst genociders on the planet, because they have just allowed Gaza to keep going, and they have allowed tons and millions of Israeli Arabs to live in Israel. If they were trying to commit genocide and actually ethnically cleanse the area, Israel could do it, and there'd be nothing really stopping them apart from international law saying, don't do that. And maybe America saying, yeah, don't go too mad, or else we're, not going to be able to support you and probably going to have to stop you. So yeah, I think Bernie Sanders is well within his rights to just try and deflect the question, because he knows it's a purity test, and I doubt he can be bothered with it.
Is that we have hundreds of thousands of children are facing starvation. That's what I have to work on right now.
Yep, and I have no problem with the humanitarian corridors that Israel have allowed, the temporary ceasefires they've allowed for to allow these people and children to get out of Gaza. I have no problem with any of that. Because, yeah, again, they're really bad at this genocide if that's what they're going for.
But if one agrees that it is a genocide, it means that other states have a legal right and duty to prevent genocidal acts being carried out.
But
you got to laugh at the situation here versus Ash Sarkar's brain, because the reality of the situation is that all these factions that have been harassing Israel, Houthis, although they're in Yemen, they are attacking Red Sea vessels. You have Hezbollah in Lebanon, and obviously Israel have started fighting back against them as well. You've had Hamas in Gaza for 15 odd years, being the dictatorship there. All of these backed by Iran, by the way. And what Ash Sarkar is effectively saying is that Hamas committed a terrorist atrocity and took Israeli hostages. She seems to expect Israel to do absolutely nothing about it, go to the diplomacy table and effectively beg for the hostages back. That's effectively what she's saying there. And then, not only that, when Israel do the reasonable thing and do attack Gaza to get their hostages back and to effectively destroy the Hamas strongholds there, because Hamas is quite clearly a terrorist organisation, all of a sudden Ash Sarkar's saying, oh, well, they're destroying all these buildings and killing these people that Hamas are using as human shields. Since I can technically call this a genocide based on absolutely no shared definition of genocide between anyone else whatsoever, surely that means that other factions in the area should be able to get involved and crush Israel. That is effectively what Ash Sarkar is saying here, and I don't know why she doesn't expect that to cause some sort of conflict that would involve pretty much everyone in the world. Would it cause World War III if that were to happen? I'm not so sure. What would definitely happen is that the US and NATO would definitely get involved with defending Israel against countries like Iran and all the other terrorist factions, and you probably just end up with a conflict that nobody really wants. Effectively, ironically, what is happening here is that Ash Sarkar is being more of a warmonger than people who are supporting Israel. Ash Sarkar is effectively trying to justify escalation here, whereas everyone else is saying, Israel, do what you need to do to get your hostages back. That is perfectly reasonable. Take out Hamas, because they are clearly only there to be a destructive force to your country. You have every right to defend yourself from them. And Ash Sarkar is saying, get every other Islamic state involved around Israel. Absolutely crazy suggestion.
See, we can talk about that, but what does that mean in real terms? Right now, what I am trying to do is what I think is probably maybe, and I can do it because I'm a senator, you can't. Right now, maybe, if we tell Mr. Netanyahu that he's not getting a check for $10 billion more to continue his aggressive action, he and his right-wing friends may decide it is not a good idea to continue to do that.
You think Netanyahu and his quote-unquote right-wing friends, which again, just it shows you the mindset that Bernie Sanders is in at the moment. Bear in mind the younger generation that signed up to the Israeli Defense Force in their droves. It's something like 60% of them signed up the next day after the terrorist attack. Like, the Israelis want the war. And the reason they want the war is because they have seen the atrocities. They have seen their countrymen be murdered in cold blood, the babies killed by Hamas, and they have gone, no, it is my duty to make sure that that can never happen again. Because clearly, we're trying to call for peace in a lot of ways, but no, they've made it quite clear that peace isn't an option. So to say, oh, it's his right-wing friends who are wanting this, no. It's an awful lot of people. It's the majority of the country want the war because they want Hamas gone. They want Gaza to be, if not Israeli territory, at least somewhere that isn't going to try and kill them. So what I'm trying to say here is that Bernie Sanders is simply naive, but at least his way of trying to get a ceasefire is actually to try and force Israel's hand to not bomb the absolute pants off of Gaza. Whereas, for some reason, Ash Sarkar's reaction is, oh, let's use the threat of more states getting involved in this war. Just a total escalation position that she has taken, and I didn't realise that that was the position she was going to end up at when I watched this interview. She genuinely wants Islamic State to effectively destroy Israel. And if that's what she wants, then of course Israel have every right to take out the Islamists in their immediate surrounding area. Of course they are justified in that.
In addition to stopping the billions of dollars in military aid that Israel gets from the United States every year, would you back calls for a cultural, sporting and economic boycott of Israel?
So she couldn't get the genocide answer out of him, so she's going to the next stage of the purity test, the step down, if you will, which is the, oh, well, should we at least economically cripple Israel? Which again, a point I'm trying to get across with this interview is that it's frightfully boring. And it's something that we've run into in Tosh. Like, Israel and Ukraine and Russia, they seem to come up every week in the international news bit. And we're bored of essentially saying Israel are obviously doing the sensible thing here. Because what more can you say? Like, they can do what they want. They're not our country. And we're allied with them. And as far as we're concerned, they are well within their right to take out factions that want them completely eviscerated. It's a completely reasonable position.
I am nervous about economic boycotts of any country, to be honest with you. But right now, what people want to do, they can do what they want to do. But
I mean, that could have been really interesting. I would have liked to have heard Bernie Sanders' perspective on why boycotts make him nervous, and we don't get it. Literally, this is what he goes straight into.
Right now, again, my job as a United States Senator
is to not send more money to Israel. Yeah, we get it. But very, very boring interview, this, as it turned out. Really, the most interesting part was actually delving into Ash Sarkar's warmongering perspective on this whole thing.
Did you feel nervous about the boycott movement against apartheid South Africa? Was that a concern you had at the time?
Honestly, quite somewhat clever interviewing technique here from Ash Sarkar. Clearly, Bernie Sanders said, oh, all boycotts make me feel bad, and now Ash Sarkar is trying to say, oh, even when it was against South African apartheid? Are you really going to say that? And I wouldn't be shocked if he brings it back to, I'm a United States Senator. I'm trying to stop money going to Netanyahu and his right-wing friends.
What I thought that as an apartheid state at that point, it was important to put pressure. But people can do as they want.
This is his ultimate answer to all of these questions. It's just, oh, yeah, I don't agree with boycotts, but people can do whatever they see fit. Which, again, is a really, really, really boring answer. As I say, I've always thought Bernie Sanders was just a naive old man, and this is just kind of proving it to me. So I can see why it was so easy for the DNC to basically kick him off the ballot and for him to do absolutely nothing, because he effectively doesn't have a backbone.
Do you think that it's right that British citizens and American citizens can go and fight in the IDF?
It's a thing I'm always a bit iffy on, I'll say. Because I don't like the idea of dual citizenship in the first place, but the thing is that you don't have to join an ally's forces, or, well, anyone's forces, really, and become a citizen there, or get dual citizenship, or even have it. I mean, the thing is that do I think George Orwell should have lost his British citizenship for going to fight for the Republicans over in Spain? No, not particularly. The guy had convictions at the time of socialism is absolutely the way to go, and then he got pretty disenfranchised pretty quickly from leftist politics after that, because he realised that it was absolutely filled to the brim with either completely incompetent people, kids, or people who were represented by the Wojak on the screen, completely crazy lunatics that would rape and kill and burn nuns alive. And due to his criticisms of all this, he actually got into trouble with the leadership of the Republicans at the time, and actually had to go into hiding in in Spain until he could eventually get back to Britain and effectively tell everyone, yeah, the leftists there were actually crazy. If you haven't read Homage to Catalonia, I'd really recommend it. It is one of the most accidentally funny books I think I've ever read in my life. And George Orwell takes a bullet. You gotta appreciate people who put their money where their mouth is, and honestly, if people are willing to fight for Israel, I don't see a reason that they should be punished in the UK. And I actually think it's a little bit different for Hamas, because they are actually a designated terrorist organisation, and people who join them should absolutely have their citizenship stripped. And I wouldn't be shocked if Ash Sarkar had the polar opposite view, but I don't care. She's a lunatic.
Well, I think if British and American people want to do that, I suppose they have the right to do it. It's not something that I've really thought a whole lot about.
Great, what an answer. I mean, honestly, you get to this Israel bit, it becomes just so boring. Ash Sarkar is just pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. It's bad, isn't it? It's a genocide, isn't it? We should think that people who fight for the IDF are evil, don't we? And Bernie Sanders is just going, I don't really care. I just don't want American money funding it.
Do you think they should have the right?
Look, I think what the Israeli government doing now is horrible. And I'm not quite sure why people would want to be, part of that effort.
This reminded me an awful lot of when Aaron Bastani had Hassan Piker on Navarro Media, and I think about halfway through that interview, he started to realise that Hassan Piker is actually a very, very, very stupid man. And he almost seemed disillusioned by his stupid answers and was clearly trying to get the conversation going into actual interesting and intellectual theory, and Hassan doesn't have any experience of any of that. So it turned into quite a slog, and it's why I ended up giving up on that series, because it just turned so boring. But Ash Sarkar here, pretty much the same thing. She is clearly getting a bit disillusioned with Bernie Sanders because he's failing the purity tests. Anyway, they then talk about Julian Assange, which I have absolutely no interest whatsoever in, so I think we'll leave it there. So there you go. That was Bernie Sanders on Navarro Media. Basically didn't say anything of interest. And the things he did say of interest were completely wrong, and all Ash Sarkar was there for was to say, let's see how pure Bernie Sanders really is. And it turned out he failed. Hence, again, the thumbnail was this. Because it wasn't just the fact that Bernie wouldn't answer on Gaza that was the interesting thing here, it was that Ash Sarkar was pushing for escalation, and you think Bernie Sanders is going to be on board with escalation. The guy seemed to just want to get out of there as soon as Israel was brought up, because clearly the man doesn't think Israel is evil in principle. He clearly just doesn't like the fact that they are in a war. Anyway, that was the frightfully interesting interview between Ash Sarkar and Bernie Sanders. If you didn't learn anything, I'm not going to take the blame for that, because there was absolutely nothing of substance in that entire exchange. So hopefully you found it entertaining anyway. But anyway, as I say, that's everything I have for you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.